All right. Recently, on the 10th of October, so almost a month ago now, the CEO of a company called Equals that builds a new modern kind of spreadsheet released an article he called The Fallacy of Freemium in SaaS. And this generated a ton of buzz, but he really gives a really candid story about the impact of switching Equals to freemium and how they decided to actually undo that change and move forward. And this graph here is basically a no y-axis illustration of their ARR over time, with the section in the middle there is showing their ARR growth during the time that they went freemium. And so I think he makes a couple of really interesting points here that I think are worthwhile to talk through in terms of what I'm seeing now, because I saw like 2 or 3 other people also talk about this at the same time. I'm feeling a meme around like freemium isn't a fit for most companies. And I wanted to sort of like dig in with you, Brian and Austin, to talk about like, well, is that true? Is freemium not a fit for most businesses? And if so, like, what are the criteria that companies should be looking at if they decide to go free? And how can they avoid this issue? Their basic feeling was early on, they worked really closely with customers and were able to close them. They raised a round and they were excited to open up the door, like make it a lot easier for people to adopt and come in by making the pricing free with some sort of paid upgrade from there. And so anyway, we don't have to go through all the details here, but they released it free and they actually found that they like it hurt their business. At least from an ARR perspective, they saw significantly less traction around it. And they have switched now to a free trial. And they actually are like still working individually with customers to get them onboarded. And he talks a little bit here that I think is really interesting. We all hear it all the time. Make onboarding simpler, get people into your product as fast as possible, make it free, you'll figure out how to monetize later. It makes sense and it obviously works for some, but it just didn't work for us. And so my question that I want to sort of like ask here is not, okay, everybody should try it and see if it works for them and then decide, but rather, what are the things that you should be looking at before you make a decision about whether you should offer your product for free or not that could actually make it successful for you? And what are the sort of meta lessons you can learn if you're a founder or a product leader trying to decide if a product should be free or not?
Yeah, at first, a couple of comments. I think Equals is a super cool and great product. Like what they've built is pretty interesting. But I think the problem with the article, not only is it missing a couple key pieces of information and data, but while freemium might not be the right strategy for Equals long-term, that might actually be the right conclusion for them. The conclusion that the broader audience and sentiment seems to be taking from this is like, freemium and PLG is bad.
Yes.
Which honestly is just a terrible conclusion, period. and it really kind of stems from a fundamental
It like went in the Twitter blender and like came out like freemium is bad for everybody, right. And it's a total waste.
Totally. So first, I think this is a bit of a whiplash back towards a whiplash I saw when the macro rough waters initially hit, which was the common advice was like, oh man, rough waters are coming. You've got to get your customer acquisition more efficient. And everybody was talking about, you got to go PLG. And so lots of people started going after it, but it ignored a bunch of things about freemium and PLG, which is one, you just don't switch instantly. It takes a long freaking time to develop because it's not just a pricing change. You have to change things around your product. There has to be some acquisition motions there. There has to be a new activation and onboarding flow, which is kind of what they touch on in this article. You've got to figure out the right monetization levers and mechanisms to convert those people over time. And so this switch doesn't happen instantly. It doesn't even happen within a year time frame. This is a multi-year commitment if you're going to start to layer on some new motion on that. So my guess is a lot of people sort of overreacted when the rough waters hit. They kind of went to this strategy. They're not seeing the instant results that they were hoping for, finding that it's actually much harder than they think it was. And as a result, they're drawing this conclusion that, it just doesn't work, right? Which is, I think, just a bad conclusion overall. I think Patrick Campbell actually nailed it on the head in some of his Twitter response to it, who's been on our episode before, which is the most fundamental misunderstanding among most folks is freemium is not a monetization strategy. It is an acquisition strategy, first and foremost. Right. And so whenever you see this topic talked about in like it didn't work or it worked and the whole conversation is about pricing and monetization, it's starting from fundamentally the wrong place. And so freemium is about how do I generate a bunch of potential energy in terms of engaged free users that I can then start to monetize over time. But some things have to be in place for that to work. One is that those free users have to be generating other users for you in some way, shape, or form, typically through a content or a viral loop. We saw this in Figma, designs, draws in collaborators, Miro, sharing boards, Notion, sharing docs, like all of those types of motions. So that has to be at its place. But the key thing about that is like when you're building potential energy, it's potential energy. It doesn't convert right away. Like most freemium strategies take a long time to see and start to play out. But you have to think about freemium from that perspective. And so I actually think what Equals has done is they've just moved the friction in their model, right? Under the freemium version of it, their friction was trying to figure out how to activate all of these free customers in a self-serve onboarding flow. And then over time, also figure out what were the right levers to convert and monetize them. And what they've done when they've switched to now the free trial is that, well, they've made the conversion to a paying user easier because the only way now I get access to the product is to pay. But over time, what they're going to find is that they've just introduced friction in their acquisition model. And they're going to have to figure out some new acquisition motions that are actually fundamentally more expensive than the freemium model, which is going to start to push them towards different segments of the market. So once again, it might be the right strategy for them long term. But at the moment, what I kind of, from the details from the articles, it just seems like they're moving pieces of the friction puzzle around the board when they actually just need to like commit to one and fill in the other pieces, right? And I think that's the big risk here is that you actually never do that work and instead you just kind of shift these things around.
Love those thoughts. I have a very similar feeling. And first of all, like kudos to Bobby Pinero just for writing the article and having some courage, just because even if the argument is more nuanced, like I think the reason we're talking about it is because he published it. So kudos there. My feeling is like freemium has actually been around for a really long time. The problems with freemium has also been around for just as long, so it's not necessarily new. And the acquisition strategy piece was the first thing I thought of. And if you look at the article, actually from the acquisition strategy lens, it looks like it worked. Like they got a bunch of low intent people to sign up for Equals, which is usually what you do if you want to acquire more people. And all I could think about was, I like to use like the lemonade stand whenever I think about these types of business strategies. And so, like if you have a lemonade stand and you're offering lemonade for $1 per cup of lemonade and you're sitting on the street, you're going to get a certain number of customers per hour. If all of a sudden you're offering free lemonade, anybody's going to take your lemonade. And so what that means is like you're sacrificing low intent users who are going to explore the product for the possible consequence of real customers not actually using your product in the future. So from that perspective, I wasn't too surprised by the fact that they acquired a bunch of low intent users and it wasn't the outcome they wanted, because again, like you both have already said, freemium is absolutely an acquisition strategy, not a monetization one. When I was thinking about like how I would think about premium or freemium versus my own company, it would be like through 3 different lenses. First one is infrastructure, which I'll talk about in a second. Second is complexity of your product. Like how hard is it for you to get to an inspiring outcome via like, the actual products experience you've created. And then the last one is the time to value, which I think is more of the user experience side. So on the infrastructure piece, I think there's a ton of value in building your infrastructure so that you can be freemium or PLG. What I mean by that specifically is like some companies build their product in a way that they have to manually provision an account every time a customer comes on board. This actually was the case at Atlassian for a really long time, and they had to spend a ton of time and money to fix the problem. It's been the case at multiple B2B companies I've worked for where they're like, if only we could just allow people to sign up. And it's physically not possible because of the way they've architected their solution. And so like, regardless of whether you pursue a freemium or premium solution, I think you should always build your product to allow anybody to sign up and use it quickly if you want to. Because once you go past the stage in company growth where you can't unlock that, you are missing out on a whole TAM. And so I think like that was the first thing that came to mind is like kudos to them for just like being able to do it so quickly, because now they'll always have that muscle motion and they'll be able to offer the product on a freemium basis if they want. You can imagine what if they have a promotion and they want to let people to try it. What if they want to create demo accounts? There's like a million different use cases around having the infrastructure to allow people to actually use the product. So that was the first thing that came to mind. Second was on complexity of the product, like how hard it is for people to get to value is completely a driver of whether freemium or premium is going to work for you. You know, like I think about Superhuman. You know, they wanted to create a crafted human experience for you, but that was because they wanted people to like do it in a particular workflow fashion. They wanted people to understand hotkeys. They wanted people to like understand that you don't need to use folders anymore. So they had a very specific vision for how people would get value out of the product, and that made the product more complex. And so if you have a complex product, going from premium to freemium instantly means that you're going to get a lot of people who are not going to understand what the product does for them. And the last one is like just time to value, which is not only a function of complexity, but also your UX, which you pointed to, Brian, is like you can't just go overnight from a premium experience to freemium if your entire onboarding flow is expecting that somebody's going to handhold them. There are all these like small nuances that you think of when you're going freemium to allow people the experience of onboarding over time in a different fashion. And if all of a sudden you just flip the switch, you're missing out on those opportunities. And again, I think that's what led to the experience that they described where they're like, hey, we got a bunch of people, but they all dropped off. And it's like, yeah, it's because again, if you're selling lemonade, you're just like leaving the lemonade out and going back into the house and hoping that you're going to have monetized customers that are going to keep coming back.
Yeah, and on that last note, the most common thing that I see is like when that switches, they're like, oh, that's cool. In the onboarding flow, we'll just like use one of those tools to add a bunch of dialogues to explain what the tool is. And it's like, no, typically you have to re-architect your entire onboarding flow, which takes meaningful product and design resources and takes time to figure out.
You may need to re-architect the whole UX of the product to make it fit that model. And I think that's the important bit like here. I think my only thing to add here, a big thing to add here is if you look at freemium as changing a linear funnel, it will almost always underperform the alternative trial or monetized version on ARR in the near term. Think of it this way, like Austin's example of the lemonade stand is perfect. If I give my lemonade for free, some more people will show up, they'll use it, but I need a mechanism. I need to think about how to turn that into compounding growth on the thing that actually drives value for my business. So the thing I thought of for Austin is like, oh, I have this really expensive alcoholic like lemonade that's like $20. And I've like now re-architected my offering to make this like free lemonade drive some conversion downstream. But also second, you probably need some marketing mechanism to help the people who got free lemonade talk about where they got the free lemonade so they bring other customers in. So you described this, Brian, as like bringing other people into the product through content or viral loops. Products that don't have growth mechanisms, either internal to the organization or strong word of mouth that makes the B2B product hop from company to company. Freemium's a tough fit because you're basically taking the same exact traffic you had before. You're getting a higher sign-up rate, but a way lower conversion, way more tire kickers, way less intent, and you end up with fewer dollars downstream. And I think that's like, it's just like almost always going to be that. When I saw this article, I was like not that surprised. The question mark is, what are the compounding elements that you are able to add that make that curve really inflect in a nonlinear way over the course of time in the future? And I think the fundraising piece is an important one here, Brian, is that like, it actually turns out it's pretty expensive to do freemium. And the reason it's expensive is because while LTVs might be very, very high, because you're converting customers in these viral products that grow and have seed expansion, et cetera, the payback periods are actually long. So if you think about a product like Slack, where it could take a year for someone to convert, but once they convert, they're going to be engaged for 3, 4, 5, 10 years and actually add seats and grow and go up and increase their ARR and have this great net dollar retention. The fact is they could convert in a month or they could convert in 3 years. So you have to be awesome at retention. You have to have something that drives multiple years of value for free forever to make sense. which it almost never does for most products. And you need some meaningful viral growth because you can't just take the same acquisition you had and like feed it into a freemium engine and hope that you get more. You need low cost acquisition. It has to be a piece of the puzzle. So I think of it as like a bunch of puzzle pieces. And if you just move one, you probably break it. The simple thing is the simplest. Come to a website, sign up, we help you set up, you pay money. Like, awesome.
Yeah.
Like, you know, that works really easily. But I think it's just a matter of like thinking of the second and third order effects, and you have to turn one of these linear levers into a compounding loop. And I think that like, if you don't have that, it's going to be really hard. So if I were Equals, what would I be focused on? Sharing, driving virality, maybe finding ways to get low cost acquisition through content or something else. I don't know what it is, but probably just turning the switch. It's going to be worse for a while. And if you're going to do it, you have to commit to it. And then like Austin said, spend the next year making your onboarding awesome to take that high friction activity and make it lower friction. Or they wrote another blog post about good friction, bad friction. We've talked about this a lot in Reforge. It might actually be okay to ask for a lot of work up front, and maybe you will convert more of them. There's lots of things, but it's a process. It's not just an A/B test that you flip and if it's better, it goes. You have to commit to it strategically, and that means having some thought about what those compounding factors are.
Yeah, look, freemium businesses are capital inefficient in the early stages, but very capital efficient in the later stages, right? So certainly in this market that we're sitting in, this fundraising market, it might be the wise decision to not be freemium because you need to be more capital efficient based on the environments. But to your question of like, if we were the Equals CEO, at some point, I don't know what it is, maybe it's like a year down the road or something, their growth is going to flatten off and they're going to have to layer on some new acquisition motion. And there's a choice, right? One choice is, oh, we're going to stay as a paid upfront product or free trial, but I'm going to need to start to layer in some of the typical SaaS acquisition motions, whether that's content marketing to inbound sales and all those types of things. And as a result, I'm going to need to charge a certain price or figure out some spread internally to justify the cost of those acquisition motions and start and continue to accelerate. The other choice is going to be going back to freemium, right? It's going to be, oh, I need to launch a free plan to open up the acquisition top of the funnel and like convert them over time. So if I was sitting in that seat, knowing that that decision is going to come down the road at some point, I would be using this period to basically learn about which path I need to go. And so one would be really continuing to work on product activation, using that manual onboarding as like a very tight customer feedback loop to iterate on that experience, see if I can get that onboarding, hyper efficient, start to build in some of those sharing loops. They will be constrained by the paid upfront, but you should start to see some of your existing users beyond the paywall start to share. Or I'm going to need to learn how I might start to justify a higher pricing point. Like what segments of the market have that willingness to pay? How do I start to identify the ICP? Like all of those different pieces of the puzzle. So that's what I would be doing. I will say that Equals has a bit of a, when you think about the products and what it takes is their alternatives in the space are typically products people have very deeply ingrained habits with, whether it's Google Sheets or Excel or even at this point like Airtable or other things that have been on the market for a while. And so to get people over the hump and break those habits can take like a lot of work. It might take a lot of product to build to get to that inflection point over time.
I actually don't think freemium is a fit for most SaaS businesses. Just full stop. I really don't. You need a lot of things to work. You need low-cost acquisition. You need simple onboarding. You probably need some sort of either virality or content sharing to drive expansion within existing organizations. And you need a really smart either value metric or set of features that are necessary to continue engagement with the product that flip it over. Most products end up with some sort of trial. It is the default. And I don't think it's a terrible default if you're building something like this to say, hey, I can be free, but I'm not free forever. It's a totally reasonable worldview to take on. And you can test around credit cards, not credit cards, etc. You can test around whether that trial is time-based or usage-based, right? Like Notion is effectively a trial. It's a number of blocks that you can use, or at least that's what it was. And then you have to stop using it. Some are time-based, 15 days, 30 days, 7 days, whatever it is. it is a decent approach. And I think actually the closer you are to product market fit, the more you should err on the side of like having individual relationships with customers. Like you need a supernova product market fit for freemium to work, because you need everybody talking about the product to everybody else. So if you don't quite have that, this is probably the better approach. So this is not a criticism, but rather a criticism of some of the discourse around it. I think it's just the key thing that I wanted to make sure I made clear here. Freemium is hard. It's like really hard. And you need a lot of ingredients to make it work. And you need to really be thinking about the compoundting.
I think growth is hard no matter
growth is hard,
right? Like every growth model has its pros and cons. You're just choosing which con that you really want to focus on or inherit. And that's kind of my point before, which is I think a bad decision is just moving the chairs around on the deck versus staring the iceberg in the face and trying to avoidance, trying to steer the ship and fix the problems. So.
Question for you guys. Have you seen freemium work particularly well for specific categories or verticals or types of businesses? I can think of one where I feel like freemium works really well almost universally, but I'm curious. One problem with I think the article and also just with the concept of freemium is like people are always looking for silver bullets. They like want to know when to apply it and not, as if it's like some standard golden rule that you apply in a case. And so I'm wondering if there are specific cases where like more or less, the rule like follows that it's like pretty good.
Collaborative tools.
Collaboration.
Yeah, collaboration tools. Collaboration and communication tools are probably the most ones. It is interesting to think about equals though on the, if we were to build a spectrum of how collaborative a spreadsheet is or how much collaboration happens in a spreadsheet, I think it's on the lower end of the spectrum when you compare it to like a docs tool, like Notion, or even designs like Figma, which is something I hadn't thought about before. Usually you have like an Excel builder, which is your finance or your data person, stuff like that. But it's not like you have a bunch of people contributing to the same Excel doc like you do in a Notion doc. But that's just like a odd observation that just came to mind.
The other one is things where the developer is the primary builder and buyer. I think at least need to be trial, but probably freemium and usually usage-based metered, because they're like trying to solve a problem at work. They're not trying to like procure some software. So they're like, if you're clear of it, you probably need a free plan, because I need to like tinker around with it and try it. But I don't think it's free I think you could do free forever or trial or some sort of metered, version. I think that's the other category that comes to mind for me. Some workflow stuff too, because you want to beta test it first before you like switch everybody to linear or whatever.
Yeah, those are the two categories that came to mind for me, whereas like one, project tasking environments like Asana or something like that, and then dev tools. And what's interesting is like dev tools in particular are such a great category for this, because developers are the core audience where they do want to be able to actually just like log in, try it on their own, hands-free. So building your product from the start to support that is a good idea. It's especially a great infrastructure idea too, because like, again, much harder to go back later and design your tool with the complexity to handle that support infrastructure if you haven't done it yet.
Another criteria is you need an empowered buyer who's willing to purchase on their own. So your end user and buyer collapse in some way. This is more or less, doesn't have to be totally true, but it is a lot easier. So if you think of like an Asana, a project manager on a 5-person team can usually has some discretion to use a credit card to manage tasks for that small team. And the other one is just it spreads naturally in the org. This is why task management is such a good freemium business for a lot of these companies, is like tasks have collaborators and those collaborators have to come in there to see what they need to do. And it just like grows, right? Same with communication and collaboration tools.